2023 has been a busy year for Indian foreign policy. Apart from holding the G20 presidency and hosting the Leaders Summit in September 2023, our External Affairs Minister, Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, has made 33 foreign trips in this single calendar year. He has visited every continent apart from Antarctica and has focused heavily on visiting Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America in the last year. In Africa, he visited 6 countries, including Mozambique, which is the first for any external affairs minister to that country. He's visited 10 countries in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia and Australia. He's focused on Vietnam. In Africa, he visited 6 countries, South America, 4 countries, Panama, Guyana, Colombia. So it sort of shows this wider picture of India's push amongst the global south or the emerging economies. We've seen that in the last 6 years of the 21 new embassies that India has opened, 16 of them were in the African continent. To put all of this in context, we have a new book that is being digitally launched on the print softcover. The book published by HarperCollins is called India's Moment. It is authored by Ambassador Mohan Kumar, a former Indian ambassador to France. He was the Indian negotiator for 10 years at GATT and the World Trade Organization, and was also part of the negotiations team for the Paris Climate Accords that was struck in 2015. Currently, Ambassador Kumar is the Dean of Strategic and International Initiatives at the OP Jindal Global University. Welcome, sir, to the print softcover.
Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So, to just break apart your book, because it's talking heavily on India's foreign policy and sort of, giving us a view of how it works in action. Your first chapter focuses on sort of an integrated assessment framework for India's stance in international negotiations, right? I just wanted you to sort of explain a bit, because you have different components and the byplay of these various components that falls under this framework. So if you could just explain this a bit to start the conversation, sir.
Thank you. So the purpose of the book is really to enable onlookers, perhaps even practitioners and scholars, not just to understand India's negotiating posture, objective, positions, but also to assess India's negotiating positions. I think it's worthwhile from time to time to look back and see whether we could have done things differently, whether we did things properly, and what the impact has been. So I set about crafting an integrated assessment framework, as you say. And as you rightly said, it has 6 pillars or 6 criteria, whatever you want to call it. The first one is the Gandhi litmus test. I call it the poverty veto. Because we have millions of poor people in India, most people don't appreciate that too drives the negotiating objectives for the Indian team, whether it is WTO or climate change or even Ukraine, I argue, and we will turn to Ukraine at some point in the future in the interview. But Mahatma Gandhi famously said that when you have a tough choice in front of you, you should actually be thinking of the poorest and the weakest person you've met in your life and see whether the decision that you take is going to impact that person negatively. I mean, if it impacts him positively, well and good, but at a minimum, it must leave him neutral. You cannot afford to take a decision where you put these people or you make these people's lot worse off than what it is. That is just politically suicidal and morally unconscionable. The second criterion is really the policy space. International trade negotiators are acutely familiar with policy space. To put it in layman's terms, it's really the flexibility that a country needs in assuming international obligations. And I argue that India needs a lot more policy space than most other countries in similar situations. That complicates the life of an Indian negotiator, which is why Indian negotiators keep pushing and trying to get as much as possible. It's not out of a fundamental naysaying instinct, That's the point I try to make. The third one is geopolitical imperatives. And I give the example of the WTO intellectual property rights negotiations. And it is now very, very clear in retrospect that the Americans put a lot of pressure on developing countries, including India, to adhere to the intellectual property rights of the WTO, which we did. We were the last country standing, and I was part of the Uruguay round as well. And we finally just had no choice but to join the consensus. So that is the example of geopolitical imperative. Domestic politics is important too. And I remember that the effigies of Arthur Dunkel, who was the GATT Director General, was actually burnt in India. And Dunkel unwittingly came out with something called DDT, draft Dunkel text. And in India, you know, DDT has a completely different connotation, and especially when it affected the farmers of India adversely. So it was actually described as very toxic. So domestic politics plays an important role. And then I talk of two other things. One is really commitment to multilateralism, or commitment to principles, if you like. And finally, really talk about realpolitik and material gain. After all, every country is in it for itself, and especially in a forum like GATT, WTO, it's about dollars and cents. It's not an organization that's just blah, blah, or speeches. At the end of the day, the trade organization deals with dollars and cents. So this is the framework that I have designed. And I'm happy to say it applies perfectly to WTO and climate change. And we can talk about it if you like. The surprising thing for me was the framework applied to Ukraine as well. And as you rightly said, the foreign minister has made a number of statements talking about how we had to buy oil from Russia. And otherwise, the price of oil would have gone through the roof, and it would have impacted the millions of poor people very adversely. So I would argue that even in Ukraine, even in the case of Ukraine, distant as it may seem, the poverty veto does play a part. So that's the framework that I have designed. And I would like to think that will help people understand the motivations for India's negotiations in the global arena.
Right, sir. I just want to, go into a couple of the components that you've sort of brought out in your assessment framework here. Specifically, I wanted to start with the Gandhi litmus test. As you said, the idea is that how does it impact an individual, right? At least it should be neutral or positive, not negative. Often it's argued when it comes to international trade negotiations or when it comes to foreign policy, right? It's hard to see how millions of citizens, normal citizens, are affected by such negotiations that are done in Geneva or wherever it happens. So if you could just sort of break down as to how the Gandhi litmus test can be applied and give like examples of, that this is something that India has applied when we look back and try to break apart and understand our different negotiations.
Sure. That's precisely what my book has attempted to do. So I'm happy to give you examples. We will take WTO and climate change to begin with. We can do Ukraine as well, if time permits. But if you take the Uruguay round negotiations, why did we object to the inclusion of intellectual property rights in the WTO or the GATT system to begin with? And I remember an American negotiator walking up to me and saying, Indians are some of the brightest people in the Bay Area. Why on earth would you object to intellectual property rights? You guys are bright, so you should be able to use intellectual property rights. And then I had to sit him down and talk to him about the fact that we don't have a social safety net for the millions of poor people in India. And if we allow only patented medicines, one of the most controversial things that India had to negotiate was the patenting of medicines. You will recall that India had only process patents. We did not have product patents before the Uruguay round. The Uruguay round resulted in a paradigm shift in the patent procedures, and you had to provide product patents. So to give you a concrete example, if an asthma inhaler was available for 20 rupees, a patented asthma inhaler will be available for no less than 1,000 rupees. You can imagine the impact on millions of poor people who don't have health insurance, who don't have access to medical care, who cannot walk into a hospital and ask for an asthma inhaler. What do? So that is the Gandhi litmus test, if you like. We couldn't have accepted very high standards in intellectual property rights. Finally, of course, we accepted a compromise by saying we will have a transition period of 10 years. There will be pipeline protection, etc., etc. But the fact of the matter is the driving force for objecting to intellectual property rights in medicines was not that India was not wanting a top-class trade regime, etc., etc. It was out of concern for the millions of poor people. Similarly, in climate change, why do you think we are not able to accept total abolition of coal? Everybody is jumping on India and saying, listen, you guys are burning too much coal. It's not good for you. It's not good for your environment. It's not good for global emissions. Yes, all of this is well known. The fact of the matter is, for the foreseeable future, energy poverty is almost equal to economic poverty in India. The quickest way for people to be gotten out of economic poverty is to provide them energy. How do you provide renewable solar, wind, and nuclear energy to these millions of people? It has to be coal, at least for the foreseeable future. I agree, we should be doing more renewables, which we are doing. We should be doing more of those nuclear and so on. But there will be a dependence on coal unless you tell me just deprive these people of energy altogether, which again would be completely anathema to the Gandhi litmus test. And I can use even Ukraine, where I hinted in my earlier response to you, we're buying Russian oil. That was not out of a great desire for oil from Russia. It was a desire for oil from any source, as long as it is reasonable and cheap. That was the only consideration. Again, oil is such an important factor for India. We depend on 80% of oil, which are imports. And oil has a multiplier factor when it comes to, inflation. So I would link it to the Gandhi litmus test. So I hope I have been able to give you enough examples to convince you and the audience that really Gandhi litmus test is something so fundamental. I call it the poverty veto, but I think it is pretty fundamental, not just in trade negotiation. The surprising thing for me was that it applies to Ukraine. I was confident it would apply to both WTO and climate change, but when I included Ukraine as my third case, I was a little less than sure, if you like. But to my great surprise, I find that it does. And I think that is one of the most important drivers, if you like, of my integrated assessment framework.
Right. And here again, I mean, the Gandhi litmus test at the crux of it is domestic. How do we look at people of India, right? So it's domestic considerations, then that becomes the principle under your paradigm in the framework. So in that case, I just want to take another pillar of this, and that's domestic politics, right? And here you mentioned in your book, you talked about the DDT affair, the draft Tunkel text, where effigies were burned. The main opposition party in the 1990s, the Bharatiya Janata Party, and the CPI came out and said, you're selling out. Yeah. You're selling India out to foreigners, right? And then we see this again in 2008 with the Indo-US nuclear deal, where, the left withdrew its support for the government. And I think it was with 18 or 19 votes is what, the UPA once survived. Right. So there's a lot of domestic politics at different moments in time. There was also during the FDI debates in 2010, 2011, FDI in retail, where you had a lot of opposition, domestic opposition. Right. So there's always this push and pull within domestic politics that may not necessarily be well assessed or well understood in the larger framework. But as you sort of pick this out and sort of gone through this. So if you could, explain to us how important and integral does domestic politics actually play a role when it comes to India's international negotiations?
Thank you for asking me that question. My own honest assessment, and I'm not sure everybody will agree with me, I actually think domestic politics plays an unduly oversized role in our system, which is extremely ironic because if you stop to think of it, and that's one of the first things I cover in my book, the Indian executive actually enjoys untrammeled power to sign international agreements. No American president can sign an international agreement, which is, a treaty without Senate approval or congressional approval. In India's case, we have followed the British system. There's nothing to stop the government of the day from signing an international treaty. The only time you have to face the parliament is when you bring a bill to amend your law to bring yourself into conformity with international obligations. And if you don't have to do that, actually, you can go and sign anything. But that is just theoretical. We know that domestic politics plays such a crucial role. I'll give you an example of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. When Russia invaded Ukraine and war broke, what do you think opposition parties were interested in? You'll be surprised. I don't think they were interested in finding out whether India did the right thing, right side of history, wrong side of history. They said in unanimity, bring the 20,000 Indian students back. That's the only thing that mattered, frankly. They just went hammer and tongs after the government and said, we are not going to let you do this. And Congress parties said, we did such a wonderful job in Iraq, and what are you guys doing, and so on and so forth. So domestic politics in India is absolutely critical. I'll give you another example. I was with the late Commerce Minister Murasoli Maran, truly a wonderful man. And I was advising him on intellectual property rights since I was India's negotiator for intellectual property rights. And we were in Doha. And this was just a few weeks after the 9/11 events. So something was going to happen in Doha for sure. And towards the end of the Doha conference, do you know the ministerial conference of Doha, WTO ministerial conference, was suspended for 3 hours just for India? Every other country agreed with the formulation of investment, competition policy, government procurement, bringing into the WTO, except India. And 3-4 hours, Murasoli Maran just put up a huge fight, and he wanted to make sure that there is no automatic assumption on the part of people that the so-called Singapore issues, which is, competition policy, investment, government procurement, and trade facilitation, will automatically find itself on the negotiating agenda. And finally, what diplomats do, we are all wordsmiths. So we use the word explicit consensus to kind of give India a bit of breathing space and make it clear to India that without India's approval or explicit consensus, this issue will not be put on the negotiating agenda. I was talking to the late Minister Murasoli Maran about this after the event, and I could make out from the conversations I had with him that he was acutely conscious of how the Indian Parliament would receive him. And finally, when he confronted the Parliament actually gave him a standing ovation and told him that it's great that you were the last man standing and you blocked the conference for 3 hours, and then we got what we wanted. So I think ministers who are ultimately responsible to the Parliament and the people are acutely aware that if you do something, then, as you rightly said, people will accuse you of a sellout. So even though the Indian executive has untrammeled power, the fact of the matter is Parliament and opposition looms large on the thinking of our negotiators. You have to be conscious of it in a rough and tumble democracy like India. So I would completely agree with you that domestic politics, if anything, domestic politics plays an outsized role. I'll just take one more minute if you allow me. I have proposed in my book that there must be at least 3 or 4 areas identified by all parties in the Parliament, and all parties must agree that we will not play politics on these issues. For example, territory. When it comes to territory the border issue with China or Pakistan, for example, when it comes to vital economic reforms. For example, I make the point that GST should have been done much earlier. It took forever. And the world is not going to wait for India to take 12 years over every reform. I also make the point that Indians are actually reformers by compulsion, not by conviction. But I think the proposal is worth considering, that all parties sit together and say, okay, let's at least have 3 or 4 issues on which we commit to each other that the only thing that will matter is national interest, and we will not play domestic politics with it. But domestic politics, I agree with you, plays a huge role in India.
Right, and I think I'm just going to pivot to the war in Ukraine because we've referenced it throughout the conversation. And here, I just want to apply your framework a little bit. So I understand, and you've made the defense of the Gandhi litmus test when it comes to domestic politics, right? And the external affairs minister a few months ago said, India is waiting for its thank you for saving the world from, a price surge in inflation, right? Because of the amount of Russian oil we've been purchasing. I understand that. So in terms of the Gandhi litmus test, domestically buying Russian oil in the midst of this war, great for Indian citizens. But then another part, which is multilateral fora, right? And there are different debates going on. The efficacy of the United Nations. We've seen how it's been struggling with regards to Gaza, finding consensus when it comes to even what's happening in Sudan. Right? So there are multiple issues with the multilateral fora. But then looking at your framework and the history of India when it came to the Suez Canal crisis, when it comes to as the Libyan war in 2011, where we abstained from Security Council Resolution 1973, which you show in your book in full why we abstain from these votes. Looking at that and looking at the war in Ukraine, how effective in terms of multilateral negotiations and fora, has India's position been? And I'm trying to juxtapose this with the fact that the New Delhi G20 declaration had a softer formulation of language than the Bali declaration, which was very clear in deploring Russian aggression in the war against Ukraine. Whereas the Indian one said territorial sovereignty in the war in Ukraine. So there was even against and in, language differences. And the EAM said Bali was Bali, Delhi is Delhi. We look at the current situation. But then in your framework, when we look at multilateral fora, how does our decision in this sort of strategic ambiguity with regards to Russia, Ukraine, yet trying to be talking about international rules, how does it work out?
So that's a good question. And I have to begin by admitting that multilateralism has failed in the case of Ukraine. So it's not just India. Frankly, this was a classic case that should have been dealt with by the UN Security Council. Some people would argue that if the UN Security Council cannot handle Ukraine, then the raison d'etre for the UN Security Council is lost, frankly. Why do you need a Security Council? And this was in the heart of Europe. It was a full-fledged war. So I would say that multilateralism took a beating. There's no question about it. And therefore, what India had to do was 3 things. And you can argue whichever way, but the observations I would make is as follows. The first thing we did was to commit to the territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. But when we say states, it's actually Ukraine in this case. So that is clear. In every single statement, India said that. What India did not do was name and shame Russia. And we abstained from all such actions of naming Russia. And we did everything to condemn the actions of Russia, but without naming Russia. And the Prime Minister went as far as to tell Putin, this is not the era of war. So I would say, if I were to honestly answer your question, I would say that domestic politics, Gandhi litmus test, policy space, and realpolitik won over other criteria of my framework, to be honest. Commitment to principles, multilateralism, I think that took a back seat. I'm willing to concede that. And I have always said, I say in my book that these are an integrated matrix, if you like, but you're not going to get equal weight for everything in any issue, in judging an issue. You're going to find that two or three of them will dominate the matrix. And that is, I think, what has happened in the case of Ukraine. But having said that, we have turned out to be prophetic when we said that dialogue and diplomacy should win. Because after 1.5 years or so, we seem to be exactly back to square one. And neither side has won decisively. You could say that India saw through this. I have said it also in my book that the Honorable Minister of External Affairs, in his book, India Way, had said that there is a mantra for multi-alignment, foreign policy based on multi-alignment. And he says we should actually engage the United States, cultivate the European Union, manage China, reassure Russia, and bring Japan into play. I give full marks to the government and the Ministry of External Affairs for implementing this mantra in the case of Ukraine. I think it is not easily understood by people that this was a very difficult thing to do. We've done three seemingly contradictory things. One, we have preserved our relationship with G7, which was not easy because we were under pressure to condemn Russia. We have preserved our relations with Russia, at least in the main, although, yes, we will be diversifying our arms supplies, etc. But in the main, we have, I think, preserved our relationship. And we have managed not to alienate the global South and try to tell them that territorial integrity and sovereignty is important. I think this was nothing short of miraculous. I thought we wouldn't be able to do it, frankly. The fact that we have done it is, I think, also because of the circumstances which changed. There was a profound impact of the war on the global South in terms of food, fuel, and fertilizer. As for the G7 summit in Delhi, the G20 summit in Delhi, I think it was remarkable that we acted as a bridge between the G7 and Russia, China. And I would say that the emerging powers comprising India, Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia, led by India, I think we just put it to the G7 after getting Russia and China on board, and getting them on board was not difficult because, as you yourself say, in Bali, they had such a language that it was a big change from Bali. So they would have, of course, agreed. But it was the G7 which had to be convinced. And I think the way we put it to G7 was it's a take it or leave it thing, because otherwise G20 will be pretty much finished. If there had been no consensus in the G20 summit in Delhi, I would posit that G20 would have been in for trouble. So I think on the whole, I make the point that I see the beginnings of India becoming a rule shaper rather than a rule taker, especially if you look at Global Biofuels Alliance, food security principles, the principles of hydrogen. All these things are principles and norms that we have tried to create in the G20. And that is the sign of India becoming a rule shaper rather than just accepting rules made elsewhere.
Right. And there's a fair argument to that, given the various organizations that India is trying to do. Recently, I think it was with artificial intelligence, we held the GPay conference over here. So there's this idea that India is shifting from a rule taker to a rule maker, or the rule shaper, rather. But saying that, Ambassador, that was my last question. Thank you so much for being here. I have the book with me, India's Moment. It's out now. Just give me a moment while I unpack it for the audience. Here's the book, India's Moment, Changing Power Equations Around the World. It's out now. You can grab it at the nearest store. It makes for a very interesting reading to assess multiple conversations. And I think it requires multiple interviews to sort of look at different individual ways to use your framework to assess India's actions, because we've not touched Gaza, or, where India gave $2 million in August 2020 to, save the UNWRA, which you make a mention of it in your book. So there's it's a complicated world. Ambassador Kumar's book tries to break that down, tries to make it easy for India to understand India's position in this. And Thank you, sir, for joining the Print Soft Cover.
Thank you very much for having me. Have a good day.
Have a good day, sir.